Welcome to Mostly Training, Dan Plews. Happy to have you as a guest. And we were just having a little chat, but for the listeners here, just to give a little context on who you are. And then I'd like to know some of the things that led up to some of the athletic achievements that you've had. But the real thing that interests me is that you've been a coach and a scientist, but you've also had massive skin in the game as an athlete, and a lot of this has occurred simultaneously. And when I say this, you are the first age group athlete to go sub 8 hours for an Ironman, and that was in 2023. Is that right?
Yeah, 2023. Yeah,
Okay.
2023. I was 40, just turned 42, like 2 days before the event.
Okay. And prior to that, 2018, you have the age group, and I believe this is still the record,
Mm.
the age group record for Kona is
Yeah,
an 824.
yeah, that's right.
2018 is was that 35, 36 year old?
Yeah, 35, 36-year-old. Yeah, yeah,
And your first Ironman was in 2013 in Auckland.
yeah, exactly. In
Okay.
Taupo, yeah,
Okay, Tapa. Okay.
yeah, yeah,
And just for my assuredness and for those that are listening, age group is basically anyone that's not a pro. Is that right?
yeah. Yeah. It's a bit of a loose term, I think. Like I'm sure. I think it goes both ways. I'm sure there's some pros who could say their age group because some of them will probably have jobs on the side of competing, and I think there's a lot of age groupers who might be able to dabble in the pro. I mean, I was probably an age grouper who could have raced in the professional area, but I wasn't going to be winning any world championships
Yeah.
or doing anything too special. And I guess that my I was always working full time, so
Yeah.
that
And,
was why I was age group. So it's basically someone who's I mean, a pro it comes from the word profession, right? It wasn't my profession. I was working, and I had a family, and that was that.
yeah. And still are and do, still you still,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So I'm just as like everyone else, but
Yeah.
yeah,
And to me, going straight up fast is impressive, but when there's circumstances that make it a little bit more complicated, that makes it, if anything, more interesting to me and more applicable to most people. And when I think about the people I coach, the people that I talk to about training in day-to-day life, peers of mine, former teammates of mine, they're all doing some version of trying to pursue either health or wellness performance within the context of their own life. And I think it's all more manageable than someone that's trying to pursue performance in a over the Ironman distance whilst also working full time because
yeah,
there's just no way to do it without a significant time investment. So that is really what piqued my curiosity to see how. So were you did your degree in Loughborough in the UK, is that correct?
that's correct. Yep.
And then you moved to New Zealand some stage after that.
Yeah. So I did my degree at Loughborough University. After I finished that, I moved. I got a scholarship with the British Triathlon Federation to be an assistant coach at Leeds University, and that was at one of the high performance centers. So that was in the very early days where like two-time Olympic gold medalist Alistair Brownlee was there, his brother was there, but he was still a junior at that point. So it was really early
What
days.
year
So
was that?
oh, God, you're testing me. Testing me now. It would have been 2008, I guess, 2007-ish.
Yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
trying to position it relative to the London Games because
Yeah, it would have been
obviously, yeah,
2008-ish
and
time.
funding at that point and thereafter in the UK for sport
Yeah. Yeah. It
looking pretty
was
good, and we
looking
know
pretty good.
that
Yeah.
leading up
Yeah.
to a games
So
in a home country, it sort of tends to peak and then
yeah, exactly, exactly. I did my masters at Leeds, and then when I finished my masters, I got a job. I got a job offer in Singapore, but it was a job offer as a triathlon coach, but working with amateurs really. It was working for expats who were doing triathlons in Singapore. It was a company we did like weekly trainings. We did some training camps, and so I moved to Singapore. I was very young at the time, like I was in my early 20s still. or mid early 20s. And then and then I worked in that job for 1 year. But then after 1 year, I transitioned to another job in Singapore, which was it was taking over. There was one of the physiologists who was working for the Singapore Sports Institute was doing his PhD over in Perth, and he needed a substitute. So I jumped in and took over. Then really became more into an exercise physiologist rather than a coach. So I was working with rowing, I was working with triathlon, I was working with cycling, but I was doing kind of more in the back end
Yep.
stuff,
Yep.
not really coaching. And then from there, I met. We also were doing some teaching with Edith Cowan University. So I would teach the lab skills for distance learning for students who were doing the Edith Cowan Sports Science degree. And with that, I met Professor Paul Lawson, and because of and then we became quite close. He was also a fellow Ironman. He did triathlon. He's one of these people who would just hit it off with immediately. We're still very close friends to this day. And he then got a job working for High Performance Sport New Zealand as the head of physiology. And he said, "Well, why don't you, we got on. He said, why don't you come over to New Zealand and, do a PhD with me? We'll get we've got a scholarship." So long story short, moved over to New Zealand to originally on a PhD scholarship.
Yep.
So I started my PhD scholarship there. After about 6 months, I there was a bit of a gap in at rowing New Zealand because the current physiologist was leaving. They needed someone to fill the gap for a short period. So I went over, filled that gap, went overseas with the team for the first time, and then I basically did a reasonable job, and I stayed for that Olympic cycle till London, and then did the whole other Olympic cycle till Rio.
Okay. So that would have been a specific overlap. There would have been some regattas and that sort of thing. We were likely same place, same time.
I would have guaranteed, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely,
Okay.
yeah,
Leading up to that London Games.
yeah,
I worked on a sports science team for about 4 years for Adidas in when I lived in the United States, and it was within industry as opposed to directly supporting athletes, but team members, the foot biomechanists, did their PhDs at Calgary and were specialized and took it very seriously. We had physiologists from Loughborough. It's a
mhm,
relatively high standard, but they were a little divorced from the direct athletic involvement with sport and as
mhm,
athletes themselves. So there's this high level of knowledge, but perhaps a disconnect between what they understood and where the rubber meets the road.
yeah,
And you, as a point of difference, for you to be doing, I think 922 for an Ironman in your first Ironman in 2013, a lot of training must have been simultaneous to your academic and your professional career. So that must have been a bit of a juggle for a period of time. And is it something that were you training for triathlon prior to 2013 and then it was time to
yeah, yeah.
compete?
I did triathlon since I was 9.
Right.
So yeah, I've done. I mean, I was a very very good junior. So I was national junior champion. I competed internationally as a junior, national youth.
Was it a family? Yeah.
Yeah, my dad did it. Yeah, so
Okay.
when he's 72, he still does it. He competed in the world half
Right.
Ironman champs
Okay.
last month in December. Yeah,
Okay.
December at the end of last year.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I've done triathlons for my whole life, so I've always at different varying levels of dedication. I think, and I think that's my philosophy is it's very hard to I don't really think there's such a thing as balance when you ever want you achieve anything. When you really got a big goal, you can't be balanced in anything that you're doing. So, like, I would always kind of have a goal, really focus on it, and then focus on something else. So, during my younger years, I was really focused on triathlon. Even during my undergraduate, I was pretty focused on triathlon. I
What
wasn't
about
the best.
at school?
Yeah, I was still very focused on triathlon at school.
Triathlon at school. It's
Yeah,
pretty
school.
abnormal because you've got runners and swimmers and
Yeah, yeah, I was. So I mean, I won the national youth championships when I was 15. So
okay.
and I remember I was swimming 5 times a week at that point. I was
And were you
very,
thinking at that point that you were going to be a professional or did
yeah,
you? Yeah.
100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. But I just, I went to Loughborough University and for one reason or another, I didn't really. I didn't really fulfill my potential through my university years. Um, but I was still very focused on triathlon, really thinking I could make it. And then once my degree finished, I guess then I really shift focus into academia and work. And so then I did my master's, and during my time in Singapore, I was still competing, but I don't think I was that serious about it. I could still do very well because I was in Southeast Asia and the competition was really low. So I would win most races still, but I
Yeah.
wasn't really focused. I was young, I was still partying, I was
Were those
partying a bit.
Olympic distance for the
Yeah,
most part?
Olympic
Yeah.
distance.
Yeah.
Yeah, only Olympic distance. Yeah. So I was young. I was like, partying a bit and having not really serious about my training. Um, and then I moved to New Zealand, and again, I was still training, not massively focused because I was doing my PhD and I was still working. But then once I finished my PhD, I finished my PhD in 2013. I did Kona in 2015 for the first time. And from that point on, when I finished that race, I was like, well, I kind of knew that I could probably win the overall age group at Kona then. And that was kind of, and I even said, my dad even remembers me saying it to him on the phone after the event. And
Mm.
from that point now, I was very serious for like 3 years. From 2015 to 2018, I was very, very serious. And once I finished it in 2000, and that I would say that I didn't grow, I still did my work and obviously I was working, but I wasn't growing things and really building on stuff. I was mainly focused on training.
Yeah.
I finished in 2018, and then I built my business. So my own business now, which is Endure IQ, which is it's basically it's online coaching and coach education. I started building that, and then by the time when I got to 40 in 2022, well, to end of 2021 really, then I decided that I'd have another good stab at doing an Ironman to do a fast time with the aim of breaking 8 hours was my goal. And then for that year, I kind of focused on really went hard on the training again. But for all those periods of time, I never ever stopped training.
Yeah.
Never. But it was just varying degrees of amounts, right? I would still do. I would still do 10 to 15 hours of training a week, even when I don't really consider that training. But then when I'm really focused, it's 20 to
Yeah.
25 hours of training a week. So it's quite different.
How
But
conscious were you of this is my priority now, and that's going to be reflected in my actions versus it being just a natural result of the way things were? I mean, it seemed like when you were aiming for a performance, then that became clear because like for this period of time, I'm going to aim to do this.
yeah,
And
I would say it was very conscious, I think. But I think things build in momentum, right? So from 2015 to 2018, it's not like you just go, right, that's it. You kind of build into it. And
yeah,
then by the end of it, the last year, I was really, really focused and really serious on it. And then when I finished 2018, I didn't really have any intentions to go back to Ironman at that point. Um, so I just was keeping fit but I was still swim cycling and running, so I was obviously had some kind of idea in my background, in my back of my mind that I was
yeah.
going to be getting back into at some point, perhaps. But then once in 2000 and after when I decided to come back and have another crack in 2021, then I really focused on it for a year. So,
When you were just maintaining what for most people would be a pretty high level of training, but for you
yeah,
was
yeah.
less volume and reflective of a different set of priorities, did you use that time to do stuff that wasn't swim, bike, run in order to develop attributes or to even just for
Not
novelty's sake?
really. I mean, not really. Well, obviously, lots of different things, non-physical, of course, because I built businesses and did all those
Yeah.
sorts of things, right? So I'm always developing on that other side. But not really. I mean, I never did any strength training when I was like when I in the build of 2018, I did no strength training at all for
Yeah.
Ironman and triathlon. And I think as a younger athlete, you don't really need to. I mean, it's a very long distance event. It's very high repetition. The overall forces are very, very low. And when you're younger, you can kind of get away with it. But I think during the COVID period, that was the point where I just started getting more and more into strength training and just
Yeah.
enjoying like circuits in my gym. Just did a few like Tabata circuits, and then in my build up to 2022 when I broke 8 hours, I was including a little bit more strength training in my training then. So I was starting to build some attributes in strength and mobility and stuff like that. Yeah.
But most of it was just sort of chipping away at what you'd known, but with less volume and less
Yeah, exactly.
specificity and
Exactly.
no
Yeah.
acute targets. But
Yeah.
to take the time each week to do that level of training, even if it's 15 hours, this was simultaneous to you working professionally with elite athletes.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so you're on any given day, what you need to do for your training couldn't be such a non-priority because if it is, then it doesn't occur. So you had
Yeah.
days where you felt either you had to or wanted to do the training, but you're also there serving these other athletes. It ever, knowing that you are still coaching now and seem like you were coaching or working in support of athletes in one way or another during this whole period, did it ever feel like there was a conflict?
No, because I wasn't. I mean, a lot of. I mean, I think that especially when I was at rowing, there definitely wasn't a conflict because I was working I was doing a very different sport. I think if I was trying to be a rower and working in rowing in that environment, it would have been a bit conflicting.
Yeah.
But with triathlon, um, my coaching has been mainly in a lot of age group and some and obviously some pros, but it's not that they kind of like it really. I didn't
Yeah.
really feel it was conflicting at all really.
Yeah.
In fact, I mean, I believe that it adds a lot of a lot of positivity comes from being an athlete yourself and doing it yourself because you can feel sessions, you have a good idea of what's manageable and what's not manageable. And you can, I mean, I think one of my greatest strengths as a coach is that when I write a training program, I can really, like, I can actually feel it. Like, I can really feel the
Yeah.
session and I can actually feel it within me physically, like physiologically, when I write a training session, that how I would feel the next day. So,
Yeah.
if I do a really big bike and a big run and then I put a threshold swim on the program, I'll look at it and go, I wouldn't want to do that session, and I would change it to a strength endurance session because that's something that I feel like doing. Or I've done a big bike and I've got like some high cadence intervals. I know that my legs would not be would like that, so I can change it to more strength endurance based intervals. And I think that's quite a skill that I have on top of all the science and the academics. I have that a good feeling of of what it is.
Yeah. As someone who's coached simultaneously to trying to peak my own performances, I completely agree with you. You develop a additional sensitivity to it maintains a connection with what the training actually feels like. And also it's a difference between being cognitively tired, which is normal if you're working and using your brain, versus the accumulated physical fatigue that if you could have felt that and that counts for something, but if you haven't felt it recently, then it becomes more vague, and then the work you're doing is a little more abstract as opposed to when you're in the trenches, then it's far more tangible. So that makes sense to me. I guess my question is loaded in the way of there were times, for example, in London I was rowing and then the next year coaching, and I remember being a director of a program, a high school rowing program, and there'd just be a very specific instance where when you're an Olympic athlete, you go to a dining hall, everyone there is like, okay, you go eat now because you guys are the priority. And then when you're a coach, you have to, you're no longer the priority in terms of performances. And so you have to very practically take a step back or to the side. Whereas over somewhere else, even within the same day, you have to make your own needs a priority as an athlete. Otherwise, you can't really pursue your goals meaningfully. So, were you cognizant that you were just chipping away at your training and it didn't need to be perfect and it didn't need to demand too much of you? You could just keep it proportionate to your professional obligations.
Yeah, I guess it's always a hard mix. I remember in 2015, I was training for Kona and I was away on a New Zealand. I wasn't away on a training camp, so we were, and that it gets a little bit tricky. But But I mean, I was just going out, missing dinner basically, and going out at night. And we were in
Yeah.
Europe, so it was it
Yeah.
was it was light until
In the summer.
9:30 at
Yeah.
night. So I was doing. And I think I'm not, maybe some of the other members of staff didn't like the fact that you go out training, but I often think it comes from a place of jealousy that they don't have the
Yeah.
motivation to do it
Yeah.
themselves. And that's true, right? They'll say, "Oh, the fact is that like if I was at home and I was working a normal job, I would fit in my training. So I don't think there's much difference, right? And it's the same as everyone else, and there's no chance that I would be the best version of myself for my work
Yeah.
if I wasn't having my ability to look after myself at the same time.
I'm sure it makes it easy also I found with when working with physiologists as an athlete, it would be very easy for them to, put you through a test battery that maybe made sense on paper, but in execution, it was never going to. And as an athlete, you knew that even before you started.
Yeah.
And then it occurs to you that if the physiologist had had more practical experience, they would know that too, because they would be able to, as you described, picture, okay, we do this, then this, and then this, and how's that actually going to go? And an athlete already knows, but the service provider doesn't. And so I would as an athlete, be willing to accept even slight compromises to accommodate the athletic pursuits of someone that's helping us perform if it gave them a little bit more understanding of what we were going through on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, exactly. I remember my PhD supervisor always taught me it's like this idea of context before content.
Mhm.
Sometimes the content of the event or the context of the time of the training period or the context of whatever it might be is always more important than the content that you're trying to provide. And I think a lot of the time as scientists, with as a PhD, you are taught above all else to keep your scientific vigor and your methods as clean as robust and as robust as possible. But at the end of the day, it just doesn't work in the practical setting. There has to be a bit of leniency with the data and accept that it will have a little bit more noise in it. But and then it's all about keeping doing it for the ability to keep consistency within the training program and consistency within the bigger context of what's trying to be achieved.
Yeah. There also seems to be something to be said for if a scientist is using the existing literature, studies in order to inform training for current elite athletes, but then some of those elite athletes may be at a point where they're doing something that hasn't been done before, and they may have real tip of the spear physiology. So, for example, I was teammates with a guy, Josh Dunkley Smith, who has a 2K world record, 7.2 liter VO2, highest gross VO2 ever recorded at the Australian Institute of Sport. I think Cadell Evans was the highest in terms of millimeters per
Yeah,
kilo, but
as in relative.
yes.
Yeah.
And so is a for me always seemed strange that a physiologist could have any sort of certainty when athletes are doing things that haven't been done before. And although
Yeah,
the mechanism should be,
yeah,
uh,
it's an interesting point you raise though because you're very correct in that science is based on means and standard deviations, right? So you're always dealing with average populations, and any output that comes from it is based on it's a mean and it's a standard deviation, which is perfect for guidelines,
yeah,
right? When you're writing programs for guide in terms of guidelines and you're writing them for general populations or a large group of people, um, that's where the science is absolutely perfect. But on the other side, what we can't do is, and when it often happens, is the opposite to what you're talking about. We have outliers who are doing things, athletes who are doing things that suddenly become the recommendations for everyone else. That's also the opposite side of it. It's
yeah,
a massive problem. So we need to accept that science needs to give the guidelines, but then as practitioners, we work individually with the athletes who are a bit different, and we solve different problems and optimization towards what they need, and that might be slightly different training content, slightly different volume, slightly different speeds, because everyone will be slightly different. But the science should always provide the starting point. You don't, because I think often we go the wrong way and we start with what the outliers are doing. I see it all the time in triathlon. You hear a good example is carbohydrate intake. You're having some elite athletes who are consuming massive amounts of carbohydrate during racing, and this seems to become the norm and recommendation for
Yeah.
age group and amateur athletes. So you're talking that you're giving guidelines that's from 99.9% of the population. These very specific individuals who are total freaks suddenly become the norm, and that's not
Yeah.
what should not what should happen. So you have to think of both sides of the equation. But with elites, that's where it's more important to like it's very hard if you're an elite athlete. You're not going to pull a cookie cutter training program off a shelf, right? Because it's probably the worst program a true elite athlete can have because by default they're not really normal. And the better you are, the more specialized your training and individualized it needs to be. But for that cookie cutter program that you pulled off the shelf for your person who's doing a triathlon, they're finishing in the top 20 in their age group, top 15 in their age group, it could be perfect for them. And it
Yeah.
probably would be perfect for them if it's based on best practice and off the science.
How did you find, just reflecting on my own experience in a team setting and feeling as though I had different physiology, more anaerobic, and have since demonstrated that than most of the people I rode with. And I could stretch my physiology to assimilate with more of an aerobic underpinning. I probably leaned into that too much, but I I wanted to the extent which a program like a Rowing New Zealand, Rowing Australia, British Rowing, that how well they can accommodate the individual needs of
Mm.
athletes within a squad, given that
Yeah.
especially with a boat like an eight, which has got eight people and they need to do training as a unit, perform as a unit, but you've got eight different variances of physiology and anthropometry and psychology within one boat, and then not an awful lot of nuance.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes really difficult within rowing, particularly within the bigger boats, right? But I mean, if I just go back to some of the things we did, when I worked very closely with Noel Donaldson when he was coaching Eric and Hamish, and
So
some of the
Noel
things that
coached
we,
me prior to London. Sorry, just to interrupt. Yeah, yeah.
okay, yeah,
So
cool,
that
cool,
whole
okay,
cycle was
yeah.
with Dono. So
Yeah, okay, excellent. So one of the things that we did is that Hamish and Eric they were reasonably similar in their own physiology, but like Hamish was very much more of the aerobic side. Eric would be had a bit more anaerobic capacity, but they're not massive amounts of difference.
yeah.
But what we would typically do is that we would do a little bit more on the ergs to kind of split them up. So, and that's where we would home into some of their own individuality. So, like with Eric, we would do kind of more longer repetitions, kind of like longer VO2 max or longer kind of
Yeah,
thresholdy,
that's where he
just
was doing some of the record attempts over an hour,
yeah,
half marathon, and
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
some on the
So I was
slide,
I
some
was
on. Yeah,
I was writing a lot of the erg sessions for them,
cool.
and like with Noel, and he would do he would kind of consult. I would do a lot of the erg, and obviously he would do everything else. But then we would give like Hamish, we would give him a little bit more of an anaerobic stimulus, so shorter reps, longer recovery, and that's the way it would work, and it seemed to work. It seemed to work pretty well. I mean, I remember I always tell the story that one of the most crazy feats I've ever seen from an athlete was Eric did 4 by 2K with 3 minutes recovery, all in under 6 minutes. It's
Yeah,
like,
it's
I mean,
yeah,
that kind of aerobic
yeah,
conditioning
yeah,
is just it's next level. I mean, it's just crazy, really. It's
yeah.
like,
So
yeah,
you were. This is usually a question I have for later on in the podcast, along the lines of who are the bigger freaks that you've been able to witness in person, and given that your exploits, but you've also coached
yeah.
Ironman of a high standard, Iron women of a high standard,
Mhm.
but Hamish and Eric were, in the mix in terms of very impressive.
Yeah. I mean, they were both very impressive. And I think I mean, who was more impressive out of both of them? I'm not. I mean, I think Hamish has probably gone on to do a little bit more.
Yeah, I
In
think more
terms of
versatile for
his more versatility. Yeah.
yeah, and maybe just his body type, with Eric being closer to 100 kilos,
Yeah.
there's less scope as opposed to being low 90s, then there's some
Yeah.
chance to apply that elsewhere if it
Exactly.
were 100
He's quite,
kilos.
and he's very, very aerobic. So
Yeah,
there's definitely those two. I think Mahe would stand out, but I think Mahe would stand out more in his, he stands out for me as much in his psychology as much as his physiology. I mean,
yeah,
his winner's mindset and ability to just to just pull it out when it matters was, and his self-belief is like nothing I've ever come across.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
very, very, very impressive in that side of things. Obviously, he was very physically gifted as well.
He must have been 541-ish or thereabouts for 2K, so sort of very close to that.
I would say he never got on the erg ever because of his back.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Later on, or do you, because
yeah. I mean,
five,
from the time I was there, he
yeah,
never really jumped on the erg
yeah,
ever. So I mean, one of the big things that I did with Mahe was I introduced a lot of cycling into his program.
yeah,
Billy's aerobic engine. He could do less rowing, and it really, really helped him because he could really only row once a day with his back. So but he was faffing around on the bike. So when I came in, I built a very specific cycling program to try and really build that side of
yeah.
things. And it made a big difference to him for sure.
Just on the cycling, because I've spoken with Hamish on this podcast.
Yeah,
Also spoke with Cam Worth,
yeah,
and Tom George, who I'm not sure you're familiar with, but he's a British rower who's the lightest guy ever under 540, and he just had the 5K record until recently. So he went 5:38, 39 at 94-ish kilos.
right.
But he was saying that he did that during the pandemic and would do the targeted sessions on the erg, minimal amount of weights, basically just core body weight stuff, and then a lot of bike riding. And in the
Mm,
Australian system, we always did a lot of cycling, but I can't help but not think of the occasions in which it went wrong. So in 2011, I was in the eight. Duncan Free, who won a gold medal in Beijing and was going to be rowing again. Sorry, gold medal in Beijing and was coming around again for London. Was on the bike, got sideswiped, broke his femur, and then I had to get substituted into the four. Basically, it's had not only for him but for the whole program this sort of significant downstream effect. And it always occurred to me that what we're looking for on the bike, from a rowing perspective, is accumulating some volume without loading the spine, but
mm,
that there is a risk that's taken, which if you're a cyclist or a triathlete, you have to assume to an extent because that is part of your sport. Whereas in rowing, it's just a means to an end. So I was, and still do feel at odds with the fact that we could, it's not as palatable to sit on a stationary bike for that period of time, but it is with less risk. So was that something that you were even are aware of, or you just think, well, let's play the odds here, the same as anyone
Yeah, I
else
mean, I
does?
guess there's always a risk of everything though, isn't there? I mean, you could also get hit by, have a motor car accident or anything like that. But I really understand that the risks of cycling are probably higher. Um, I think you can do things to, I mean, it's the same with everything, right? Is minimize the risks, is not ride your bike at the busiest part of the day. And if you do have to ride your bike at the busiest part of the day, you go inside. I mean, even when I was training for triathlon, I would only ride my bike at the weekends outside. I wouldn't ride in the middle of the week because I just decided it was too big of a risk. So
Yeah.
there's small things that you can do. And I mean, I learned this the hard way because don't forget, just before London, Mahe got hit by a car as
That's
well.
right. Yeah, and so and just before Beijing, James Tompkins, who I was in the eight
Yeah,
with, I remember he came off. I was behind him. We were going down a
yeah,
descent, and he just rolled off the side. And
yeah,
we
yeah.
were in Italy, so it must have been pre-Lucerne. And it's these all the times when it isn't an issue, it's not an issue. But then I could think of the real
Yeah.
occasions, and then I'm like, is this necessary? As much as I am on board with the everything else. It just,
Yeah, it depends. It depends, isn't it? Like, I guess it's dependent on a few things. It's dependent on one is that athlete able to ride indoors a lot? Some of them just can't do it. You just drive you mad. Another issue is how much is the spine? How much does the spine need to be offloaded, and what's the injury risk? Like
yeah,
Mahe could only ride once a week, once a day. So
yeah,
he had to ride his bike as a second session.
yeah,
Like, I mean. Eric did no cycling, because he loved erging,
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
it's not it's just a bit about personal preference and requirements.
yeah,
It's like we talked about earlier, context before content. For Eric, is it worth the risk? Definitely not. For Mahe, is it worth the risk? Probably is, because without it, he's not going to be winning an Olympic gold medal, I would say.
yeah, yeah.
So it's
It does seem like having the individual discretion where possible is
mm,
also, but allowing the athlete to choose their level of risk. So
yeah,
for Eric, either preference or risk perspective, it wasn't the choice, but for Mahe, it was a little bit different, even if their
yeah.
goals were very similar.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
and like yeah, like I say, like I don't think Mahe would have won in London if he hadn't been riding. If he'd just been doing one rowing session a day, then not. And I
Could he
think
have done, the stationary bike for two
yeah, but
hours?
but I think a big thing that really helped him was he was getting out and doing three, sometimes 4 hour rides.
Yeah.
He was doing very big rides, and I think for him it made a big difference because it helped with his weight, it helped with his calories, and he was a big guy, so I
Yeah.
think it was a real benefit. So. It's just dependent. Like Hamish like riding his bike. He wasn't doing any sorts of. He was doing a lot indoors though. He wasn't riding out on the road hardly at all. But he didn't need to because he didn't need to do the longer rides. But I think it's hard to expect someone to ride for 3 to 4 hours on an indoor trainer, even though people do it, right? But it's pretty
I'd imagine
mind-boggling.
we've both done it.
Yeah,
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 time and place, but I also think that's less repeatable because the
yeah.
sweat losses are far more
Oh
significant.
yeah, and every time you do it, as we say, it takes a tooth, right? You
Yeah.
don't. You've
Yeah.
only got so many of. I mean, I would do those sessions if I had to in the lead up to a big event. If it was like pouring with rain outside and it's impossible to do, I would do those sessions. But like if you're doing those every week, it's just crushing.
Yeah.
So
I also think there's something to be said for with changes in terrain, you're getting out of the saddle a bit more.
oh yeah,
Whereas if you're sitting on a stationary bike, you've kind of got the output
yeah,
and it's less organic. So you're stuck in that position. You can get other overuse injuries that wouldn't
yeah,
occur.
yeah, for
So I
sure.
know it's not over here we've got a ton of risk and over here we've got zero. It's a I just had those moments where dramatic things have happened because we've chosen to do the bike, and this is someone who's
And rowers
likes.
and rowers aren't typically that great at riding bikes either. So you've
Well,
got
hang on, let's see. We go.
that.
Good physiology for bike riding, but bike skills.
Yeah, bike handling skills isn't up there, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'd have guys that just absolutely physiological phenomenons, but they're riding bikes that aren't well maintained, and they're in a
Yeah,
rowing suit with a flanny, and so
yeah,
they can ride very, very fast guys off their wheel, but if you put them in a peloton, and I'd put I'm the same. Those are skills, and that's why a rower, if they wanted to be a cyclist, then
mm.
the time trials are more likely to suit them on balance.
Yeah.
But
Well, and that's exactly what Hamish did in the
yeah,
end, right? So,
yeah.
yeah,
Um, you'd mentioned substrate fueling before, and I went out looking into a little bit. I It was funny because there's the conversation regarding fueling and carb usage, and it felt like you had been pigeonholed as a bit of a low carb guy, and the phrase that you used was the right fuel for the right time, which
mm.
I'd imagine is closer to how you actually think about it. But it does seem as though you have some wariness about relying on carbs, or at least thinking that the way that elite triathletes fuel is applicable to age groupers that aren't doing the same training volume. And part of your development in perspective, it did seem like you'd hit some plateaus or maybe a ceiling on your performance, and then had some adventures in low carbing, found that it worked for you, and so it's been a bit of an evolution over time.
Yeah, you're definitely right. I mean, I think for me, I mean, obviously we all come with our biases, but like taking a low carb approach to my diet made the biggest difference ever, in terms of, and I feel it was always the gift that kept on giving. It improved my performance, it improved my recovery, it improved my weight maintenance and stability. And it turned me from like a 410 half Ironman person to a 350 half Ironman person. And who athlete, but the thing is it only that? Probably not. There's loads of things going on that have
Yeah.
affected that. But for me, it's made a big difference. And I do think that we as athletes, we're just taught that it's one way. There is no other way if you want to compete than being on a high carb diet and shoveling as much carbohydrates in your system as you possibly can. And I'm not going to sit here and say a low carb diet is better than a high carb diet because it isn't. In reality, they're very specific to the contents of the event, but most of the time they're quite similar. If you give yourself enough training adaptation, if you give yourself enough adaptation to the diet, you'll end up with a very similar result. There was a paper that was launched, 6 weeks adaptation, 800-meter running performance, no change. It's
I put
exactly the
six
same.
on the low side, but 800 is also pretty glycolytic. So you'd imagine it would show up there
Yeah,
as much
800
as,
is very
yeah,
glycolytic.
yeah,
So, like, I mean, so the crossover point between anaerobic and aerobic is about 1 minute and 15 seconds,
yeah,
right? So you're still talking highly glycolytic for an 800-meter running.
yeah,
So it can be both, and also how much, as long as it's just you're not really you're obviously using carb, but there's no way, even on a low carb diet, you're not starting a 500-meter row, for example, full out with not enough carbohydrate to get you through that system. It's a neural brain thing that's making you feel like you're more tired, right?
yeah.
So it's more of a sugar kind of neural situation going on. So so yeah, and I think the bottom line is that I believe athletes have options. You don't have to be high carb. You can have lower carbs, and you'll still perform just as well if you do it right and you give yourself the right ability to do that. I think for athletes who are doing shorter distance events, they're going to get zero performance advantage from being in a low carb diet for sure. Like it's just going to give you. It's
What
like
do you think the threshold is now that you're doing events that are around an hour, and we'll talk about that, but that's a lot different than
it's
8 hours.
difficult. I think the threshold is probably when you're getting over 6 hours. Yeah, well, yeah, I wouldn't say probably it is when you're getting over 6 hours. Even a half Ironman
Yeah.
probably not that much because the way you can fuel and now it doesn't. It's probably not making that much difference. Potentially four half Ironman, but I think 6 hours would be well. I'd be confident to say that's where you're getting a real difference. But it's just like there's papers that are published and they'll say, oh, look, this low carb diet didn't help these 10-kilometer race walkers. Well, of course it didn't. It's just not really an event that's really dependent on
Yeah.
preserving endogenous carbs, right?
Yeah.
But to finish off, what I'd say is that like athletes have options. If you're an athlete who doesn't particularly respond well to high sugar, you might be pre-diabetic, you might be going that way. You don't need to fuel on super high carb diets to perform. You can lower your
With
carbohydrate
the
intake.
caveat that there's s- a lot of events that are shorter that may increase the need.
Yeah, but I don't think that's what I'm saying. If you adapt long enough, I'm not sure
You don't think that there's
I don't think you'll see that much
yeah.
of a
Okay.
decrement if you do it correctly. And like I said, there's papers published now that have shown that, like 800-meter running, you won't see that much of a decrement, provided you give yourself enough time to adapt. It won't. But it also won't give you a performance advantage either. So
Yes.
depends what you
It's a lot of
what.
individual variability, both in nutrition and in training and then performance execution. Because what you were saying in terms of it unlock the certain performance capabilities for you, and it's just not just the start line to the finish line, but the training leading up to that, obviously. But then you'd be aware of the ultra runner, David Roche, for example, who was sort of meddling, and then he now is a high carb advocate. And obviously, in the cycling world tour as well, they're very conscious of carbs, grams per hour. And this is something that, carb tolerance can be improved, do you think when you hear about those athletes, yes, that makes sense and that's working for them in that context? Or do you think maybe they could do better if they were utilizing some of the strategies that you are?
No, I don't think they necessarily do better. But again, like we're talking about those athletes who are Tour de France riders, they're not normal people either, right? They're talking about 99.9%
Yeah,
outliers, and also within the context of a tour, it's very different because you're not just talking about fueling for that day, you're talking about giving your body the fuel that it needs for the next day. And they're doing activities that you will never have the ability to fully fuel by just eating at the end of the day. So I
yeah,
think there's a bit more to it for the Tour de France riders. Fueling during is also helping probably the recovery
yeah.
and keeping in a non-catabolic state throughout the tour. So it's definitely helping in that regard. The what you said about the gut training is an interesting one, not really proven.
Mhm.
What's shown is that everything when it comes to carbohydrate intake, we have limitations on our carbohydrate oxidation. So that's why most carbohydrate products they'll have glucose and fructose added into them because it increases your carbohydrate oxidation. So
Yep,
glucose alone is about 60 grams. Glucose and fructose goes up to about 90 grams. But as we go higher, our efficiency becomes less. So we just I think there's like about 90 grams, we're about 70% efficient. As you go
yep,
more and more, it becomes less and less. As the intensity of exercise goes up, it also becomes less. So Ironman, if you're taking 90 grams per Ironman, you probably have more efficiency versus 90 grams for a 2 hour event because the intensity is higher. The efficiency gets less and less and less.
yep,
So, but what it shows with the gut training is it doesn't improve your oxidation. It improves your tolerance.
yeah.
So I think we get confused with the differences between tolerance and oxidation. Like,
So people are perceiving less GI
yeah,
stress
as a
as
positive.
better
As it's better,
absorption.
but it's not actually
Yeah.
necessarily improving your performance. Of
But it
course, it's
might be
if you're
neutral, not
yeah,
worse.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's just sitting somewhere in your gut, and who knows who really understands what's happening
Yep.
with it. But it is a performance benefit if you're taking 90 grams and you're getting a sore stomach, and then you train your gut and you take 90 grams and you don't get a sore stomach. Of course, that's going to be a performance benefit. But apart from that side of things, it's not increasing your carbohydrate oxidation. So.
Just to talk about specifics for you and for myself, when you're saying low carb, I think this is for the listener, this is not ketogenic, which is depending on where the threshold is, under 30 grams, under 50 grams, under
Yeah.
100, low, low. For you, what does what would it look like in terms of grams for a normal training day and perhaps a rest day?
Yeah, it's anywhere between 100 and 200 grams. So not,
Okay.
it's not crazy low. I mean, the thing is that I don't believe the ketogenic diet is not something that should be maintained long term. I
Yeah.
think it has a few negative consequences to it. I think it has benefits at times, but it has to be cyclical. And like if you think about how that looks from a
Cyclical is in weekly cyclical, so having a like a
Not
re
not 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 even. I mean,
yeah,
it will be daily cyclical in some situations
yeah.
because if you're an athlete, for example, and you're following a lower carb diet, you get up in the morning. So say you have your evening meal, you have a salad and a steak, some protein, you limit the carbs. You get up in the morning, you have something that's maybe pure protein and a coffee. You do a long ride 3 hours, whatever it be. You don't fuel with
Yeah.
carbohydrates during that ride. You use some other kind of
So your
substrate.
fat usage goes
Yeah.
up. Yep.
By the end of that ride, you will be in exercise-induced ketosis.
Yeah.
So in that way, it is cyclical, and that's the kind of way that I would train when I was doing Ironman. Is that I would kind of always after training in the morning, I would likely be in ketosis, and
Yeah.
I'd often measure it, and I was in ketosis, but I was still at 100 to 200 grams a day. So for an
Yep.
athlete, you're very cyclical all the time if you're kind of doing more of that right fuel, right time sort of approach to your fueling.
Yep. Um, that makes sense. Is there ever any consideration for peri-workout carbs so that you could prolong the training effort and increase the fat utilization? Because if fat usage stays at a constant and you keep replenishing the carbs, but the fat fuel has to still be there.
Yeah.
And without exogenous carbs, exogenous fat, your fat fueling has to come from somewhere. And then if you could push out the volume and perhaps the intensity of the session, that you could
Yeah.
increase your,
So like, I mean, one of the main things that drives, one is you want to keep the intensity low for fat oxidation because
yeah.
if you're the higher the intensity, the less you'll be
But you
burning.
can shift that over time, can't you? If
You
you
can shift that
yeah,
over time, yeah.
yeah.
But if you'll never shift it like super high, right? And you probably don't want to either. You want to have the best of both worlds. If you're really doing if you're someone who's, for example, is doing like threshold or VO2 max training on low carb, you'll probably end up shifting your fat oxidation too high, even at a very even at a very high intensity, and you'll see that because your top end will go to shit. It'll go really bad,
Yeah.
and you'll if you're measuring your lactate, suddenly your peak lactate will be 12, and then you can't get over 5. You know, because
I've
you
I've
have
been
no
I've been
yeah,
there.
because you have
Yeah.
no glycolysis
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
But so you probably that's what we talk about right fuel, right time. You don't really want to have that as a desirable output. But if you're at a low intensity, what we know happens is that over time, the longer you go, the more you ramp up your fat oxidation because you deplete glycogen gradually and you use less and less and you ramp up your fat oxidation. The funny thing is that you'll when we start exercise will generally burn the most carbohydrates at the start of exercise, and then fat oxidation will gradually increase. So, if you want to improve your fat oxidation during exercise, or I wouldn't say improve, you want to increase your fat
Yeah.
oxidation during exercise, you start with low muscle glycogen. You start with muscle glycogen. That's the main driving factor of fat oxidation during the start of exercise. So, what I would generally say to my athletes is that there seems to be that the first 1 hour to 90 minutes is the point at where you have the ability to kind of get your fat oxidation up really high quite quickly. If you're fueling with a lot of carbohydrates during that period of time, you probably won't ramp it up as quick as it needs to
So you
be.
could delay and then for 90
Yeah,
minutes.
exactly.
Yeah.
So the best product, if you really wanted to do a good fat burning session, if that was your aim and you wanted to try and increase your fat oxidation, you would glycogen deplete before you do the session, and then you start fueling after about an hour to 90 minutes.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
you started on this in about 2012, is that? I think I
yeah,
heard you
that's right.
right.
Yeah,
And were you looking at, because I remember post London getting into this a little bit, it was more, and I did full keto for a period of time. And were you looking at was it Finney and Volek,
yeah. Well, I mean,
carbs?
the main person who I was looking at was Tim Noakes, really, at that
Oh
time.
yeah, because he'd shifted, he's
Yeah,
made some shifts over time as well.
yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder for me, I'm 100 as of this morning, 107 kilograms. And so my needs for carbs, all else being equal, are going to be higher. So I also wonder with say a round figure like 90 grams that is supposed to be applicable to a 75 kilogram cyclist, surely that should scale for a bigger athlete.
Yeah, it would scale. I mean, what you mean in terms of 100 to 200 grams of carbs, you mean?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I wonder what that amount would be scaled for me in similar context
Yeah,
because
it
even
depends what you're trying to achieve, and it depends what your training is as well. You know, if you, I wouldn't say it would be that different for maintaining your high intensity. I mean, uh, it'll be a little bit different because you'll have a little bit more storage than most because you've just got more muscle mass, but
yeah,
it wouldn't be a huge amounts of difference. My views over time is that for all athletes, the main thing you want to get right first before you think about your fats and your carbs as your proteins anyway. So
yeah.
if I was advising you, I would be saying, well,
It's one of
what's
the
your pro?
first things I advise. It's that, 2 to 2.2 grams per kilo
Yeah,
as
and
a
it
is
depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you're
yeah,
someone who wants to lean up, I'd say you go to 3 grams per kilogram body weight. And if you want someone who wants to kind of bulk up a little bit, go down to 2, and then the rest can come from fats
yeah.
and proteins,
I
and
find
fats
that
and carbohydrates.
when I do that, then and it could be because of the intensity that I'm trading off some volume for some more intensity, but then I could feel that I'm fully aware that there's some gluconeogenesis happening because I could smell the ammonia.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
know that I'm using protein as carbs, and then just feels like I'm having less efficient fueling as opposed to just having direct carbs. And I've done some
But
fairly
you should
significant,
still, even at 300, even at 300 gram, even if you were as high as 3 grams per kilogram of body weight,
yeah.
there's still quite a lot of leeway for a lot of carbohydrates if you had your fats low. Yeah,
Yes, that's if.
yeah, yeah. If you
Yeah,
had,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, and
exactly.
but it tends to be there. It's either higher carbs and lower fat, or high
Mm.
fat. And how much do you think that, given that for anything to work, it needs to be sustained for a period of time, and that there's just a preference, whether, and that could be underpinned by physiology, or it could be taste buds, or
Yeah.
the
Well, I mean,
unknown.
that's the main. I think that's the main thing that you would want to ask athletes. It, like when they're adhering to any type of diet, is the main thing is consistency and what they can do the most easily.
Yeah,
Like I think if you like for me, maintaining carbohydrates between 100 and 200 grams a day is really easy,
yeah,
really easy. I can do it. I can do it day in day out, and I would still say I'm pretty close to that now. I don't measure it as much, and I'm not as fiddly about it. But I think I'm almost naturally like that even now, even when I'm training for Hyrox, and I don't really focus on it because that's just the way I prefer to eat.
yeah,
I prefer higher protein diets, so I like that. And because of that, and I don't really eat that much carbohydrate. I'm just generally lower in that area, but it's
yeah,
the thing that's maintainable for you. Like a ketogenic diet is a total nightmare. Like you try
yeah.
maintaining your carbohydrates for to less than 50 grams for any more than 3 weeks. You got to be a very disciplined person. So yeah,
Yes, you do, or you have to be inclined that way.
mm,
I,
yeah,
I'm.
exactly. I
You
think
aware of Sean Baker? Do you know who
the
Sean
great thing
Baker
about
is?
focusing on, sorry,
You know who Sean Baker is?
yeah, I do, yeah, the
Yeah,
meat.
yeah, the meat guy. So
Yeah,
I'm talking to him in a little while on the podcast, and
yeah.
I'm very curious to what extent he is going this path now because he's, the meat guy or the carnivore guy, and he's sort of attached to that versus I think we're all going to work better as omnivores. So I'm wary of carnivore. I'm wary of veganism, even if I could see that they work for some people in certain contexts. I think that the safe middle ground probably makes more sense, that there's a philosophical choice that's happening rather than a specific need to avoid all fruits and vegetables and grains, or,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
all animal products seems to be in principle more than
yeah,
something that actually helps.
I agree. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree, and I think it's like you can't say that it should be balanced because otherwise we'd be like 33%, 33%,
Yeah.
33% each, right? And I don't think that's right. I think one macronutrient has to be above the rest.
Hmm.
Um, Probably I would say that one should be, I wouldn't in terms of calories not, but I think the one that we should focus on is mostly protein because
Protein.
it's doing the most, it's the most important.
What are
Um,
your recommendations? You go more 1.6, or I mean, if they say it's 1.6 to 3.3 in terms of,
Anywhere between 2 and 3. 1.6 I think is way too low.
yeah,
Yeah. Between
yeah,
2 and 3. But dependence on the goals. It's like, if I have an athlete who wants to lean up a little bit, I'd put them closer towards the 3. An athlete who's just more maintenance and they're in a happy kind of, they're just maintaining weight and they're training well, I'd put them more towards the 2 to 2.5.
yeah.
Um, but the
Tell
good
me if
thing
you have
about,
this experience is when, for me, that's normal. I can easily eat 300 grams of protein in a day and have for the most of the last decade. But and I am those recommendations too, mostly because it's necessary for maintenance and growth of muscle tissue, which over time is more important, but also in performance. And then there's the appetite mitigation. So it's the most satiating, but
mm,
it's also the least convenient if most people have been underpinning it, which they have because it's of the food that's generally available there in, say, a shop or whatever, anything that you're not making yourself, they're going to underpin the protein because it's the most expensive portion of any sandwich or whatever. So most people, unless they're conscious of it, are underpinning it, which means that even people that you're trying to create a deficit, you often need to then increase protein, and then all of a sudden they're eating more than they were before, but with this shift, they're now satiated and having a harder time to get it all in as opposed to the prior state, whereas they never felt fully
Yeah, but this is the
content.
this is the point. If you have someone who's struggling to put on weight, then you probably want to go low in the protein because
Yeah.
like carbs. The thing about carbohydrates is, and this is the problem, and but also the benefit is that you can eat a lot of carbs
Yeah.
very easily.
Yeah.
It's
But most
not
people are trying to, there are cases, but most people they're trying to get to a low point.
exactly, but
Yeah.
there are specific cases, and I think with athletes, the thing that I really like about proteins is as a way to help athletes achieve the optimal body composition is that in my experience, athletes are great at doing things. They're terrible at not doing things.
Mm.
So if you say do this, have this protein, they'll do it. But if you say avoid this, don't do this, it's really, really hard for them.
Yeah.
So it's a much easier
It's
psychological.
self-regulating, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
it's just a very good way to get to help and achieve what you're wanting to achieve by just using that scale to go either lower or higher depending on what your outcomes are.
Yeah, I'm self-interested, like I think we all are, but I tend to own it. And so when I'm thinking of, how does this apply to me? I just say, I'm thinking about how this applies to me. And I'm caught in this space where what I'm trying to achieve now is elite within context because a sub 3 hour marathon at 100 kilos is, I think, a very special performance, but it's not elite by most measures. But I'm still have this elite athlete body. I have this elite athlete mindset. And so I'm trying to differentiate between what does and does not apply to me because even with that amount of protein within the recommendations, it it doesn't do an awful lot to abate my appetite. If I'm trying to bring my body weight down, which is some process that I'm going to have to lean into to, because I think what I want to do is achievable at 100 kilos, but not at 107.
Mm.
So I need to increase volume, but also do it with less fuel. And when I have sufficient protein, it doesn't provide me with sufficient fuel, it feels like. And the fuel that I then use, well, the food that I consume as protein then gets turned into fuel anyway. So it just feels like a inefficient
Yeah, well,
strategy.
but I would argue that you don't need a lot of carbohydrate fuel for a max deadlift. There's a
Nobody
professor.
want a max deadlift and then a marathon.
Yeah, but you could do that burning a lot of fat.
Yeah.
You could shift your substrate to burn a lot of fat in the marathon. I mean, there's people who, I mean, you're not actually running that fast. No, it's not like you're running a
No.
2 hour marathon. You're running a 3 hour marathon. So it's
Yes. But 3 hour for at this size is there's almost an equivalency in and
it's true, but you're still regardless, the duration is still longer, right? So
yes.
you will your fractional utilization where you are to your threshold will
Yeah.
still be a lot lower because you're running 3 hours
Yeah.
than it would be if you're running 2 hours because you can't maintain that higher intensity of 3 hours versus two. So
Yeah.
relatively, you will still be at a reasonably low intensity for a marathon over 3 hours. You'll be somewhere between your between VT1 and VT2. You'll be in the right in the middle of there somewhere for
Yeah,
that for that.
I ran a 3:14 in 2009, just after Beijing.
Yeah,
And this is why I believe I can go a bit faster.
yeah.
There's not without some precedent. There was a lot that I didn't execute well first marathon. Happy with learning from that. But I do remember that my heart rate was higher than, like I was closer to threshold than I thought I would be for longer. And I also think I can maintain that. You can develop that skill to maintain that for longer, even if it's has to be proportionate to duration. But I do think I would, instead of running it down here and going for pure efficiency at this size, that may be off the table to some extent, so that my carb usage will be up relative to most people that are going to go for 3 hours. So it feels like it's right at this
But
point.
the only thing you have to maintain during that period is your blood glucose, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so there's a theory. So I mean, obviously you can. There's a theory in terms of fatigue. It's like glycogen depletion, carbohydrate oxidation, which has not really been proven. The strongest association is hyperglycemia. So that's why if you start with a low tank, like low liver glycogen, low muscle glycogen, you'll
Yeah.
definitely fatigue more quickly because you're gonna run yourself into a hypoglycemic state very quickly. So it won't make that during the event. If you start the event, if you train so you can build your fat oxidation a little bit, you start the event with a full tank, you fuel during, and I wouldn't be going crazy amounts, anywhere between 60 to 90 grams an hour.
Yeah.
You'll be, I think that will be your best way forward. You should look at this a professor called Dr. Andrew Kutnik.
Okay.
He's a bit of a beast in terms of weightlifting. And you'll probably think he's not that strong, but for me, he looks pretty strong.
Oh, it's all
Um,
relative, like
well, I mean, he was hip thrusting 200 kilos.
okay. Well,
But,
not the exercise that you'd hang your hat on, but
but
yeah.
I mean, that looks pretty strong to me.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Still moving some tin, so
yeah. So, but he's a diabetic as well.
okay.
So, he's very into his glucose regulation and fueling and stuff. So he's quite.
Okay. I will have a double click on that. And just before we move on, my fear has always been that if you upregulate fat utilization, that you're then down regulating carb utilization. And there's still enough of my training, even with the barbell focus, which is a smaller portion of my overall training volume, but not
Yeah,
one
that's where you would right fuel, right time yourself,
yeah,
right? So if you're doing your running and you're doing your endurance runs, you might want to do them a little bit like low glycogen,
yeah,
low feeding. But then when you're doing those sorts of things, you want to be fully upregulated. And the important thing is that it probably won't happen to you as much because this the said principle, specific adaptation of imposed demand. So if you're doing very glycolytic exercise with a full tank of carbohydrates, you'll be continuously regulating it. Endurance athletes, the problem is they'll go low carb, they'll then try and do any high intensity also with a low carb, and they're not like you, so they're not very glycolytic anyway. So
yeah,
they down-regulate all the enzymes associated with glycolysis and get very, very bad at that kind of work. Whereas you're probably that's your strength anyway. So if you're doing that type of work and you continue to do it, then you'll be totally fine, provided
yeah,
you fuel around it properly. Like
yeah,
one of the things that I always say, well, I always there was a great paper that was written by Dr. Tommy Wood, who showed that one of the main problems is that if you're trying to adapt to to a ketogenic diet and you stop doing glycolytic activity, you're definitely going to lose all your enzymes associated with glycolysis because you're not training it. So you just
yeah,
have to keep training it. The principle of specificity and the law of reversibility, the very simple principles of training. You just have to keep on making sure that you're stimulating the right areas with the right fuel.
yeah. I mean, most of what I do in reality is undulating output to fuel. So if I have a high, like I'm refueling based on what I've done and what's to come. So I'm not consuming more carbs than necessary, and I'm cognizant that there is a threshold, but I guess I've just developed a wariness because I've had sessions where I feel underfueled, and I think to leave the fueling discussion aside, I know that you've co-authored a lot of thermoreg heat acclimation papers, and so you've been in the weeds on that, and that has some influence on fuel usage as well. All else being equal, hotter, more humid increases carb utilization. And as discussed, I'm in a subtropical environment. And so for right now, typically it's 80 to 60% humidity and 25 to 30 degrees Celsius. And so I'm playing a game where I need to be very cognizant of hydration, electrolytes, but it does seem like it increases the carb demand. Leave that for me to, with your insight, and to further investigate myself to figure out what works for me. And that's ultimately what everyone needs to do. But I just wanted to pick your brain a bit on the heat side of things. As it stands, as I'm building running volume, I'm using an echo bike, an arm
Okay. Yeah.
leg,
Yeah.
but right. So to me, that feels more like the physiological stress than just using a bike. And I've Hamish happily deferred his original um, willingness to use the assault bike was because he saw me using it for just because it takes the spine out of the equation, but
Yeah.
it has a more similar physiological load to the erg, which is how I came across it. So I'm using that as my primary conditioning tool. If I'm going to accumulate some T2 minutes, it's going to be on that apparatus. Now, if I'm looking at my output and my heart rate and my perception, and I'm triangulating where I need to be based on those, the given the environmental factors, the output is going to be proportionately lower and the heart rate's going to be proportionately high at the same perceived exertion. Given that there's this chunk of time where I am for 4 to 8 months of the year where it's going to be pretty warm and pretty humid, do I just accept that that's what it is and have my output be as it is relative to the training zones that it ought to be? So if the output is lower by whatever amount, say it's 20 to 50 watts because of the environmental conditions, do I just bite the bullet and accept that's what it is, knowing that when the conditions, when the weather changes, that I should get a boost because I've been training with this heat stress for the majority of the year? But I'm aware that in most of the studies and when using heat training beforehand, before a specific event, it only needs to be 2 to 6 weeks to develop that physiological benefit for a specific competition. So my concern is that I'm somewhat compromised for the majority of the year because my output is limited. So then that begs the question, do I do all or some sessions in a temperate, temperature controlled environment? So in a room with an aircon, whatever needs to happen for it to be 21 degrees or 18 degrees and
Yeah.
50% humidity.
I know. Yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So do I, as it stands now, do I strive to do that for every session with having the occasional session in the natural conditions, or the inverse, which would be the occasional session where temperature is controlled? Or do I do what I'm doing currently, which is just accept things as they are and believe that there will be a boost that will only occur seasonally?
Yeah, I mean, I would change it dependent on the type of training you're doing. So anything that doesn't really rely on a output for the response, I would just do it in your warm conditions and accept that and use heart rate as your guide.
Yeah.
And so if you're doing your endurance, your level two stuff, use heart rate as your guide and do it outside because you're probably going to get a little bit more benefit in terms of training adaptation from the heat component. And then anything that you're doing that's like if you're doing VO2 max intervals, I mean, if you're doing like anaerobic or like short sprint intervals, you'll probably benefit. There's studies that show that you actually go better in the heat.
Yeah.
Provided you're not doing many loads and loads of them, if you're just doing a few of them, you'll probably go better in the heat. So there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're doing anything that's like threshold VO2 max, I would do those in a temperate condition to maintain your output a little bit more. Then you get the best of both worlds.
Yeah. So okay, that has been I did a FTP test on a
On an
cooler
assault
day,
bike.
on the Echo bike, yeah.
Oh yeah,
But it was
sounds
a,
painful.
yeah, well, it's just all versions of the different shades of the same
Yeah, yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a 500 meter erg versus a 5K, they don't hurt any more or less. It's just the time span. Even 24 hours versus a 24 hour didn't hurt any less or more than 500 meters. It's just
Mhm. Yeah,
the how searing it is versus
yeah,
how, you're having the experience yourself. It's an hour versus 8 hours.
yeah, yeah,
There's more in
exactly.
common than not, but I'm not doing any super short stuff at the moment. So it's either at or near threshold or steady. And so that seems to provide some clarity for the steady stuff. Just accept the lower output and keep the heart rate where it needs to be. And for the performance sessions, try and have those in a controlled environment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay. It does seem like because the majority of the sessions, if I'm even having a slightly polarized approach, that would mean that the majority of the sessions and the majority of the volume would occur in the natural environment.
yeah.
And I measured my sweat
But I mean,
losses.
if you're feeling, if you, I mean, again, it's like if you're feeling really tanked and you're really tired, then you just go easy on yourself and go in on a temperate inside. I mean, that's what I mean. It's a bit of self-preservation and self-regulation is important, you know.
Still, I'm still trying to, it feels like a concession. And because I'm mindful of, well, all else being equal, if even at 140 beats a minute, if I'm in the heat, that will provide more adaptations than not. But I met last Friday, just because it was last Friday, I actually measured sweat losses pre-post, and it wasn't just before or after a session. I kind of had three modalities back to back, and from my post hydration but morning weigh-in, so pre-training to post-training at just before 2 p.m., it was 10.6 liters out.
Mm,
And that feels normal here. So I'm like it's a pretty significant responsibility, even with for me relatively low training volume. Just the hydration game
yeah,
is pretty significant, but everyone's got their stuff that they need to deal with if they want to do cool things. So
yeah,
that's mine. Thanks for helping reaffirm my
yeah.
protocol.
No worries.
One last thing I wanted to touch on was that you are dabbling to an extent in Hyrox and dabbling, to put it, you're taking it fairly seriously. I think you're seventh all time for over 40-year-olds.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, is that something that are you away from triathlon at the moment and doing this, or is this with a view to go back? How are you
I mean,
framing?
I'm away from triathlon as an athlete. I mean, I'm still heavily involved in
Yeah,
triathlon as someone in the community and coaching a lot of athletes. I'm still as involved in ever in that. I'm just not competing myself. I'm just more coach, educator, scientist in that space now.
yep,
But yeah, I mean, as an athlete, I'm 100% focused all in on
all
Hyrox.
in. Okay, you're
Yeah,
taking it pretty seriously then.
yeah. I'm going to the Worlds in June,
Yeah,
so.
I have an athlete that's an age grouper that's in the 50 plus that's
Yeah, yeah. So
going
I'm
as
gonna
well.
so that's my big goal, and I'm gonna try. I mean, I think I've still got. I mean, I've only done two,
Yeah,
so I'm steadily improving, and even at the. I mean, I raced at Auckland at the weekend, and there's still loads of things I can see that I did wrong and I can improve on. So I'd be really. I mean, got my eyes on the prize of maybe a podium at the World Championships. I would really love that. It'd be amazing. So. I'm doing Brisbane. I'm moving up to. I've only done the open weight so far, so in Brisbane I'll move up to the
pro
pro
weights.
weight. Even though I don't really like the word pro weight because it's just heavier. Don't know why it's pro. It's not like you're a professional
It's
when you do it.
the medicine ball for the wall balls and for the farmers carries. Are they the only thing that's
No,
heavier?
it's all heavier. All heavier. Yeah.
Oh, and the
So the
sandbag.
so the sled
This,
push goes from
yeah.
150 to 200 kilos. The sled
Okay.
pull goes from 100 to 150 kilos. The farmer's carry goes from 24 to 32 kilos. The sandbag goes from 20 to 30 kilos, and the wall ball goes from 6 to 9 kilos. So they're all very achievable. Apart from I really struggle a lot with the wall balls. That's the hard thing for me. And it's because and it's not. It's more a mobility. I'm really having to work on my mobility and my upper thoracic to get under the
Yeah.
ball. But yeah, I
Thoracic
mean,
extension. Yeah.
yeah, that's my thing. I mean, hours and hours of doing Ironman, you're in that forward hunch position and
Yeah.
stuff. Like my upper thoracic is not the most mobile, but I
Yeah.
mean, it's been really good because I mean, I'm slowly getting more mobile, and I'm live 42. I'm probably more mobile and stronger than I've ever been. So it's it's a
Yeah.
good thing.
Yeah. It does seem like it's serving a purpose beyond just scratching the competitive
Yeah,
itch.
exactly. And like when I finished competing in Ironman in 2022, my big aim was like right, that's it. I really wanted to put on muscle, I really wanted to get bigger. So like for 6 months, I just really focused on strength training and I ate a lot of food, really up my calories, up the proteins. I was doing 6 90-minute gym sessions a week, but very bodybuilding focused
Mhm.
gym work. So, like focus muscle groups slow on the eccentric phases,
Like a
really.
bro split, as though, yeah, it's bodybuilding effectively, if that's not, even though that's not the goal.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah, I wasn't going to be in a bodybuilding
Yes.
competition,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
wanted to be bigger and wanted to have more
It's so
size.
hypertrophy, which must
Yeah,
have been new for you.
yeah, exactly. So I was doing a lot of that, and I went from 75 to 89 kilos. Pretty,
70,
pretty,
75 to 89.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
pretty pretty quick. But
That's
this is the result of me being forcing myself to be 75
mhm.
and then letting it go and then forcing myself to be heavier. So I think, naturally I would and naturally I was like 75 wasn't really where I wanted to be anyway. So it kind
Yeah.
of I went straight out to 80 into the 80s pretty quick and then, I ate a lot, forced myself. But I didn't really enjoy it because I didn't like just training for the sake of it. I like having a bit of a goal, and I like having.
A performance goal. Yeah.
I'm a competitor, right? I like to compete.
Yeah.
So then my brother did a Hyrox, and I figured that was a perfect mix. But in hindsight, like if I was to recommend a triathlete going into Hyrox, then I would tell them to do the exact same approach as I did. Is that for 6 months you just focus on building a bit of muscle and then get back into it because you don't lose your fitness very quick that much. I was still doing.
Was it concurrent? So you were maintaining some aerobic training as
I
well?
was doing very
Yeah.
little, a little tiny bit, but not very much at all,
Okay.
really. But now I'm like 85 kilos, and
Yeah.
I was running 3:30 splits at the weekend for my case, so I can
Yeah.
still run pretty quick,
Is
which is
that, do you
good
think,
for
around
high rocks.
set point for you? I mean, it's hard to figure out what your set point is when you've been,
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I feel at 85 I'm heavy enough to perform both. I mean,
yeah.
there's a lot of the guys who are doing well at high rocks are in the 90s though. So
Yeah. Yeah. I do
there's a
think
big
over time
there's a big spread.
it will select more and more for people that can run a fast 10K or half
Marathon.
marathon. Yeah.
I think
And
I, I
they're just
think
sufficient in the strength.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think there's a degree that I mean, you look at someone who's doing a half marathon or really well, a really good half marathon, they're in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
They're in the 70s, 60s. They are never going to be able to do the exercises. So there's always going to be a compromise.
Yeah.
There'll
Yeah.
always be that, but that person who might be running a 63 half marathon
Yeah.
might pack on 10 kilos and still be running a 66.
Maybe like a Ryan Hall.
Yeah, someone like him, but I'm surprised he hasn't got into it. But I don't know if you know, there's a runner in New Zealand called Cam Graves, who's a friend of mine. And I think he's a 63-minute half marathoner. He's really tall, and I keep saying to him, someone like him will be the next generation of athletes in the
Yeah.
sport he's tall, he's naturally forcing himself to be a little bit lighter, but he's still an exceptional runner, 63-minute half marathoner, one of the best in New Zealand. If he got into it, I think we'd see a real shift.
Yeah. It definitely seems because I can look at high rocks and I go, oh, I like all those things, other than maybe wall balls and the burpee broad jumps. But having been the open world record holder in two of the domains, but then you
Yeah.
realize within that context, it's pretty irrelevant. Those are like get through stations
Yeah,
without
and
conceding.
and those two stations are probably the least most important
Yeah.
stations, you
Yeah.
know? And it's
The
all
time
about
where you can lose the least.
Yeah, and it's all about energy. Energy. It's an hour event, right? So it's
Yeah,
energy conservation. So it doesn't actually serve you to smoke a really fast ski because
no,
because as you know, like if you go from a 145 split right to a 135 split, you save 20 seconds, but you are shedding a lot of calories and a lot
yeah,
of energy for
yeah,
20 seconds. It's not
yeah,
worth it.
yeah.
You know?
You're
So
breathing out
it's the
your
same
ass
on the
on the back
road.
end of it versus just
Yeah. And whereas if running, if you speed up running, you actually you expend the same energy because you just
yeah.
do it faster. So it's not smart to do the
It's a running race with some other stuff thrown in,
yeah,
but that other stuff can really blow up your
yeah, and
aspiration.
there's a lot of good runners who aren't doing well in Hyrox.
Mm.
So it's not just it can't just be a running race because there's a lot of people who are very I know a lot of athletes who are much faster than me at running, but they're not faster than me in a Hyrox, for example.
Yeah,
So there's a little bit more context to it than that, I guess. And you'll be surprised if you ever do one, you'll be surprised at how your legs feel when you're jumping from the station to the next. And even cardiovascularly, the station when you go from like run to burpee broad jumps to run to row and then run again, you're totally gassed.
yeah,
It's beyond it's one of the most cardiovascularly demanding jumps. Oh, it's really, really hard. Really
yeah,
hard.
yeah. It does tickle my curiosity, but I'm not even in good enough condition now to have a meaningful crack at it. So I can just observe at an arm's distance, like, oh, that looks good, and I get the appeal, and but thankfully at this stage it's just a matter of curiosity.
Yeah.
That weight gain that you had, just to touch on that, I think a lot of people would find that surprisingly, although when I spoke to a guy named Phil Clapp who has the 1,000 meter and 500 meter world records on the rowing machine, and he went from 103 to 123 pretty quickly just because he went from keeping it down for rowing to I no longer need to do that. So he sort of filled out his frame. And when I was rowing, I was mid 90s, but my set point's more like 105. And so when I stopped, I went and actually lent into it immediately to 110.
Yeah, yeah. Because
And I
I
think,
think my set point's more like 80, to be
right.
honest.
So you think you're a bit artificially above that?
A little bit now, but I
Yeah.
mean, I think because I do a lot of weight training and I eat a lot of protein, I'm a bit higher. So, yeah, I would say my set point's probably 81, 82.
Do you think that's for Hyrox, given that you are taking that pretty seriously, that it decreases your efficiency, or do you think that you can benefit from that because it helps you in some of the other stations?
Decreases in my efficiency in what?
Well, because you're heavier for running.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
100%. Yeah. I mean, but I've been surprised at how much running hasn't been affected by the weight
yeah,
gain. But I think like 81 Ks is a bit different to me running a marathon in an Ironman. You know, I don't.
yeah,
If I had to run a marathon in an Ironman now, I don't think I wouldn't be running a 2:45 or anything like
yeah,
that. You know, so
yeah.
yeah,
Okay. And I guess the one question I'd like your perspective with is just for me, for my selfish aspirations, if I'm above where I think I'll perform my best at, because I think I don't need to be this big for my deadlift aspirations. I've already deadlifted 320. I think I could do it 100 kilos. And if I'm any heavier than that, it's going to make the marathon significantly harder per kilo, especially seeing as it's not useful kilos. It's just all
yeah,
bulk. Do I, as I build running volume, expect that my body will naturally find it'll utilize some of the superfluous tissue. I'll find a natural point, or do you think that I should seek to find a better body weight with which I can then build volume from? Because I am at this time as I'm building running volume, noticing that my plantar fascia, my shins are
yeah. I mean, I would be using the bike to get your weight to and what use the bike to build your aerobic volume, and as you get lighter, I would be replacing the biking with the running.
yeah,
You know, and slowly build up that way. Because I mean, the last thing you need is to get an injury, right? So,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
another thing you could try is, I don't know if you've heard of the lever. Have you heard of that?
Uh,
It's
In
like
what?
a little thing that sits on the side of your treadmill that takes the weight off you.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
makes you
Yeah.
a little bit lighter, and I
Yeah.
think that could be really beneficial to you because it'll take you down to 95 kilos. You'll still get the running movement and you'll still get the aerobic conditioning without the pounding on the joints. I
I
think.
have thought about getting a treadmill just even because there tends to be less shock even from
Yeah,
the treadmill compared to most artificial surfaces. At the moment, I'm just doing a lot of stuff on grass and sand as I build up volume, but my body lets me know pretty quickly when it's too much too soon. And then it's just a matter of whether I'm paying attention or not. And given where I am, this is a longer term project, more likely next year than this year. So I've got some time, but I also don't have time to waste. It feels a bit like when you were aiming for your sub 8 hours, that it's not as though, hey, this is all chips on life or death, but hey, this might be one of the last big rolls of the dice in this domain. So I want to do things
yeah,
properly.
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
Great. Dan, I really appreciate your time and your insights, and thanks a lot for coming to the podcast and having a chin wag. Is there anything that you would like to point the listener towards if they want to hear more from you or to access some of the educational materials that you'd mentioned?
Yeah, yeah, I guess I'm most active socially on social media wise on Instagram, so at the Plews. And yeah, you can check out. I have my own business, Endure IQ, which is mainly around triathlon. We're going to be starting something separate in the hybrid Hyrox space as well, which will be a totally different company, but we'll be doing something in that space, which will be called Endurox, which is
Okay.
on that side. So that'll be me and Dr. Adam Story, who's used to work with Valerie Adams and strength power guy.
Oh, that's cool.
So between the two of us, we've got everything covered, I think. But yeah, they're the main places. I have a lot of content in Endure IQ. So many blogs that go back a long time, educational courses, and anyone who's interested in the endurance space. So yeah, check it
Great.
out.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thank you.